Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here at the Policy Circle Summit, and it is my honor to facilitate this conversation with our wonderful panelists. So maybe I'll have you all come out and then introduce you. Come on out. Thank you. Okay, this is Elizabeth Watley. She is the CEO and president of Forest Forward, which is a neighborhood revitalization organization that's dedicated to breaking the cycle of intergenerational poverty. Before that, Elizabeth was at City Square, where you worked on restoration efforts in South Dallas, and particularly focused on the homeless community. So welcome, we're so happy to have you. Next to Elizabeth is my friend, Dr. Ryan Streeter, who is the Director of Domestic Public Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. For his work there, Ryan works on lots of issues, including poverty, homelessness, education, technology, and I could go on for a very long time on all the things you cover at AEI. Ryan is also the State Farm James Q. Wilson Scholar, and in addition to that, he has served in government for Vice President Pence when he was Indiana's governor and for George W. Bush. And then to Ryan's left is Brian Truby, who is a senior principal at Overland Partners Architecture and Urban Design. Brian has been responsible for putting together designing critically acclaimed sports and entertainment facilities, including the SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles. So welcome to the panel. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are talking today about reimagining the city square. And I'm sure all of you have heard, I'm sure you've experienced it in your neighborhood, but you've heard that there is historic demand for development across the United States. And the big question we have to ask ourselves is, well, if we're going to do this, how are we going to do it, and how are we going to do it well? And our panel today will talk about a lot of the issues we have to consider in this space, things like design and proximity and great institutions that need to be in communities, all the questions we have to ask ourselves in order to create communities that thrive. So we're going to jump right in, and in thinking about a vibrant community, Elizabeth, I'd like to start with you.
Sure.
For Forest Forward, one of the central insights that I understand sort of animates your work is this idea that your zip code has such a strong effect on your life, including things like your actual life expectancy, even more than your genetic code. Can you explain that insight and talk to us a little bit about how you see that on the ground in South Dallas?
Sure. So first, I will highlight that the work in South Dallas is in zip code 75215. As you mentioned, it is a predictor and an indicator of your life expectancy more than your genetic code, but that really details your environment, your educational opportunities, your surroundings, and your habitat. So when you're improving quality of life and life expectations, it's really this whole neighborhood revitalization development that's included in that work. In 75215, your life expectancy is 67 years. If you drive 2 miles north, you get to live an extra 16 years. So that's pretty telling on the dynamics of how an environment plays a really big part of your health and life expectancy.
And just give us a sort of 2-minute overview on Forest Forward in terms of what you folks are focusing on in that space.
Absolutely. I've tried really hard to get this down to 30-second elevator pitch. But if you're not familiar with South Dallas, we are kind of your textbook underserved neighborhood. And one of the ways in which that is highlighted, our community was impacted in the early 1950s that a highway came through and divided and bifurcated the neighborhood. And when that happened, that completely transformed the community. It was predominantly a Jewish community. The Jewish community moved north. And then the neighborhood was suffocated with segregation and redlining policies. All the schools in South Dallas were forced to retire their school names and mascots and their colors. The Forest Theater, which is an anchor of the project that I lead, was once a predominantly Jewish facility where people of color had to sit in the balcony. By 1956, the theater had to completely change its business model and cater to the African American community to survive. And so I highlight that timeline because it shows you how quickly the neighborhood transitioned in demographics and opportunity just through that highway coming and dividing the neighborhood. So the work that we're doing at Forest Forward is to try to reverse that impact in partnership with using public policy, boots on the ground, and philanthropy. So we are going to put $50 million into the Forest Theater. And so the way I describe that in a bite is we're like the Apollo Theater of Dallas. We're very rich in history. It's dilapidated, but it is absolutely a city charm. And so we're going to bring it back to life, but we're not going to stop there. Combined with this work, we are creating a cradle to college education pathway that is anchored by the brand new MLK Arts Academy. That is the only school in DISD now that serves from pre-K all the way to 8th grade with an arts thread. So a direct pathway to Booker T. Washington. And then we're going to bring over 150 units of mixed income housing to deconcentrate poverty and diversify the socioeconomics. So Stacy and Sylvie teed me up really well here about, I'm the boots on the ground piece and the action on the work.
You're really handling development in every aspect of the community.
Absolutely, it's very holistic, and we really want to change environment, quality of life, and your surroundings, your day-to-day impact. So I think while I'm absolutely in love with the theater, the school will be the anchor why families move to the neighborhood for those educational opportunities for their students.
So Ryan, let me turn to you for a second. You know, you run, in addition to many things, a major project at the American Enterprise Institute called the Survey Center for American Life. And so while we're talking with Elizabeth about looking sort of granularly at a very specific community, you're looking at data, you know, nationwide. So I wonder, can you tell us a little bit about that project and then maybe some commonalities you see among communities in terms of sort of pillars that make those communities vibrant?
Great, yeah, thanks. Thanks, Vanessa, and thanks for having me. It's great to be with all of you. You know, much like you were just describing, successful neighborhoods have a number of different factors that all kind of work together and in common. And we started this survey work at AEI mainly because so much public polling work is just obsessed with political attitudes now, and you can be forgiven for thinking we're all about ready to tear each other's heads off if all you do is ask people questions about their political views. But there's a lot more going on in America, and so we've kind of revived some of those old survey questions that Bob Putnam did in the 90s that kind of spawned the social capital research industry, you know, understanding how relationships knit people together and have all kinds of other positive outcomes in their lives. And one of the things that we decided to do was actually try to get a sense of how close people were to neighborhood institutions and amenities. In part because we wanted to test this hypothesis that neighborhoods themselves are kind of important civil society mediating structures. There's this really important book about 40 years ago that Peter Berger and Richard John Neuhaus wrote called To Empower People, and they talked about mediating structures being those institutions between kind of large corporate or government institutions and individuals that are important for the cultivation of democratic habits, for attachment to community, for civic virtue. They talked about families, they talked about religious congregations, they talked about local charities, and they talked about neighborhoods. And since that book came out, not because of the book, although in part because of it, there's been a lot of social science and economic research on the first three. We know a lot more now about the value of stable and healthy families, the role of faith-based organizations and community-based organizations. Neighborhoods haven't been studied as much. And so we decided to undertake that and found some really interesting things. Some of the, you know, social science is often sort of the proving of the obvious with very elaborate methodological schemes. But what we found is that when people are within a short walk or drive from a certain kind of tipping point number of neighborhood amenities, you see a lot of the same sorts of effects that you see with those other three institutions. A willingness to volunteer, a greater sense of attachment to community, a willingness to say yes when asked to help out. And so it doesn't really matter if you can walk or drive, it's just being close to, when you just think about it, when you're not at work and you're not at home, where are you? You might be at the supermarket, you might be at the park with your dog, you might be at the local coffee shop. And when people live, we created an index out of respondents, and we did this, of course, on these very large national surveys, and found that when people are proximate to a certain cluster of these kinds of organizations or institutions, you see these similar types of effects. And I think I think that's really important, that social capital is something that's created through these very important institutions that we know about, civil society organizations and families, as we often call them. But there's something about just bumping into people over and over again. You may not know the name of the barista, but you know the barista. You're standing in line and you're talking about what's coming up this Saturday in the community. And that sense of attachment is really important. So two people can live in the very same community, and if one person doesn't take advantage of the amenities that are there and the other person does, the person who does will have a higher estimation of the value of that community. They'll be more willing to say yes when asked to volunteer. And all of those social capital effects are measurable in other types of ways. You're more productive, you have a better outlook on the future, and all of those things. So when we're, and much to your point, when you're redeveloping communities, it's obviously first and foremost important to be thinking about affordable housing and giving people a safe and affordable place to live. But we should be thinking more broadly in terms of affordable neighborhoods and having those core institutions there, because they're really important for the connecting of children with other families, with the ability for people to get engaged in their community in sort of unplanned ways as well as planned ways.
So proximity, that is a critical component.
Really important.
To make sure everybody is happy, engaged, and so engaging their community but caring for it as well. So Brian, tell us, I have to imagine you're bringing in these really incredible sports and entertainment facilities into neighborhoods. I mean, do you think when you get at the very beginning of that project, are you thinking, is proximity something that you're thinking about in terms of like where you're locating a stadium, or like what other assets you're putting around the stadium? Are you making sure that it's closely connected to the community?
It's a great way to actually talk about a really important subject, and we focus on the physical world and what can we do with the physical world, and the relationship between that and policy become so important. We believe we are architects of the public realm, and almost all of our projects are public-private partnerships. And so part of our job is to educate about what is included in the public realm. And what we're very focused on is creating place. And the way to create place is to, in many cases in our work, think about the large indoor room and the large outdoor room, and what's the relationship between those. If you just think about classic architecture, what's in the foreground is essentially just as important, if not more important, as what's built. And when we talk about public realm, it provides access and a place for all the amenities and the things that make a neighborhood a real neighborhood. We've had the privilege of working on a number of very large-scale projects. I never sought out scale in anything that we do, but our large-scale projects get significantly more media coverage, and so most people think that's all we do. The reality is we had the privilege of working with Elizabeth from the very beginning on the Forest Theater project, and so our version of this same focus on the public realm was really to spend the right amount of time engaging with the community, which Elizabeth and her team has also done an excellent job of. Our goal was, how do we restore many parts of that neighborhood in a way that's respectful of how it evolved in the first place. And so the focus on the public realm doesn't have to be just a giant park in front of the building like we were able to do in Minneapolis, where we talked the city into taking out of play 3 blocks of real estate in front of the stadium so that we could create one of the biggest and really most activated large public urban parks in the country. It also has to do with how do we take an icon, really one of the last 2 remaining icons in South Dallas, the Forest Theater, and how do we treat the area around it such that when we do that, it lifts the entire community in ways that are unique to that community, not ways that are a duplicate of other neighborhoods that have, in fact, candidly been upgraded in ways that aren't very inclusive. But how do we do that in a way that keeps the unique qualities of that neighborhood very meaningful, but also creates a place for all the things that are missing traditionally in historically disadvantaged neighborhoods. So that's a little bit about our approach and the things that we've been privileged to be involved in.
Well, let me ask you, you referenced the history. Elizabeth, you did too. And so the history is obviously a critical component, but let's talk for a second about the folks in the community in this actual moment, right? So how do you, through your design firm, how do you interact with folks on the ground living there right now who are going to live through your construction and then hopefully enjoy what you put into place? How are you communicating with them, and what are they generally telling you? Are you finding that it's common things that come up over and over again?
I think most of all, communication, starts with listening, and it's easy to say listening is the key. Actually, the quality of the way that you listen is actually the key to how that works, and who you have representing you that creates a bridge for listening, because every community wants to be listened to through an authentic source for that community, and many times that's the most careful and strategic thing that one can do is decide who in the community is the best representative of that community, and then to create a way for that dialogue to happen that's not only inclusive, but creates some significant joint intelligence about how this community is completely unique from any other community. No community in any, in Dallas we have an amazing spread of neighborhoods. I could by memory walk through 35 distinct neighborhoods. They all believe, and in fact are radically different from each other. And the way you listen to them and the way you provide all kinds of services besides what we do physically into those neighborhoods must absolutely be unique and specific for their particular needs.
So, Elizabeth, can I jump back to you for a second? I think we've probably all seen in our own communities when there's development happening, there are lots of different kinds of opinions in our community, and everybody has their view, right, and their own lived experience. How do you navigate between that? Is that complicated, or are you in a place where just showing them how much you understand what the need is overcomes those challenges? Is it difficult?
So I think anything in community development is difficult. I have been in community development for almost over 15 years now. So before the Forest Theater project, I actually transformed a football field into an organic farm at Paul Quinn College. And so there, I'd have old football players come back and say, I used to play football here, this is homecoming. And I'm like, well, sir, now there's turnips there, so sorry. But with the Forest Theater, it's completely different, right? And the reason we're so fortunate in these conversations is people want it to come back to life. People want to live in a healthy community. People want access to entertainment. People want access to high quality education. So these aren't things that people are resistant to. It's more like, when are you going to get this done? Yeah. But one thing I want to highlight in that conversation, you mentioned history, and what about the people now? In South Dallas, those people are still there. Right? There are people that have lived through the highway construction, have lived through the segregation and the mass movement of people. And so they bring those memories and stories up. And the best thing about the theater is it has this cross-sectional of respect and experiences. People are like, I met my wife here, and it crosses all backgrounds and all communities. So the theater serves as this melting pot within South Dallas where everybody wants it to come back to life. I will also say the South Dallas community is very vocal. They will let you know when they do not approve of something. Yeah. And so, as Brian was saying, the listening is a big piece of that, because you have to be able to respond, because no matter how much money we raise, no matter what we do to really try to bring this investment, if no one comes, we've got a paperweight. So really making sure that we listen, that people want to see the community vision come to life is something that I prioritize on a routine basis.
Ryan, do you see, when you're looking at it from your vantage point, looking at multiple neighborhoods at a time, are there sort of key communities of stakeholders that we should be thinking about when you think about development in neighborhoods?
Yeah, and I think that it helps to think of neighborhoods as districts when you're redeveloping them. And often when we use the word neighborhood, we think about we picture something very residential, And Brian talked about being architects of the public space, and you think of the notion of the public square. If you've traveled in Europe and you've been to some of these beautiful, towns and cities where they actually have a literal square, with the key institutions on it. When we're thinking about neighborhoods holistically, you want to kind of have that notion in your mind, even if you don't have a physical square. And I think the like the British High Street model is actually kind of a good one to think about, where, if you go to London, I lived in London for a few years, and I think it's just one of the best cities in the world, and it really is a collection of districts and these individual high streets. You have main streets all throughout the city, and everything kind of organized around that. And so when we're looking at our neighborhoods kind of holistically, you want to think about who's along that high street. And so it's clearly it's the civic leaders of a neighborhood, and those could be pastors of local congregations. It could be the public charity, or the private charities that affect the most people, that run the most programs for kids. And you really, there's so much collective wisdom in those organizations that's not written down. You can't find it in a manual, but you have to have those people involved because they're the eyes and ears of the neighborhood. But then you also have the business leaders that are along the main street as well, along the high street as well, and they have a real interest in the forward progress of that community too. So it's really just it's kind of the gatekeepers of the daily life of a community, and at the local level, that's going to be this kind of this Venn diagram of sort of three sectors. You're going to have some public leaders that need to be involved. You're going to have the business leaders, and you're going to have the civil society leaders, and they all need to be engaged because the neighborhood belongs to all of them.
So how about this? You've got a room of super civically engaged people who want to do the best for their communities. If we were living in your community, Elizabeth, I'll start with you. What's the best thing that we can do individually, right? Let's just say we're not leading an organization. We're just a person living in your neighborhood. What can we do to help you and to support your efforts?
Sure. So first I'll just say, because I didn't get to say this in the beginning, is that I love having the ability and the opportunity to speak to a group of women. This is such a special room because I know the type of power that's in this room that women exude throughout, and especially in our communities. And one thing that you do primarily is show up. The women in South Dallas are a powerhouse. So we have meetings, they utilize their voice, connections, but what also has happened is this web of a network of them continuing to bring people to South Dallas to see the value in the neighborhood and donate. Right. The best thing about 75215 right now is it doesn't matter the amount. People are contributing to see this come back to life. And so that is happening by people spreading their wings and bringing investment to their neighborhood.
Which absolutely anyone can do, whether it's $5 or $500.
Absolutely. And just making the connections and saying, hey, come see what's happening. Someone told me we're the best kept secret in Dallas. And so helping spread the word is certainly a big thing and a big piece of this work.
Well, I'm hoping we're helping you with that problem.
Yes, I appreciate that, yes.
Yes. How about you, Brian? Is there things that you've seen in the multiple projects that you've worked on, when you think about communities, if you wish you could have whispered into someone's ear, this is what I wish you would do to help this project along, what would it be?
Well, I think the earlier panel discussion, which had a lot about education in it, and we tend to talk about education like it's a K through 12 issue and maybe a little bit higher ed, but education is really a lifelong pursuit. And one of the things we've learned in our projects, like I said earlier, there's always a public side and a private side, and this is a partnership. And candidly, there's a lot of focus on education for us because usually neither side, especially in a project of significant scale, neither side of that equation has a lot of experience at that. And so a lot of what we're focused on doing is educating. Everybody says they want to do a transformative project, but the path to actually accomplish that is a lot harder, a lot messier, and takes a lot more focus. And that's really one of the things that we've been fortunate to lead on a lot of our projects. I don't know if this image is coming up on the screens here, but Fair Park, a project that we're involved in here in Dallas, is one of the most largest but most latent assets really in any large city, and it's only a few blocks from where we've been lucky to work with Elizabeth on the Forest Theater. And I think it's so ironic that in a part of town in Dallas that has been so disadvantaged for so long, yet it still has the largest collection of entertainment, gathering, and assembly spaces, and especially Fair Park, which sits in a 277-acre park-like environment. I think these two projects, totally different scales, but I think both of them are a really good example of how education and bringing different groups together to realize how to achieve something that's truly transformative is really a lot of what rooms like this should be about and are about, clearly from your mandate and your mission. And I think that's why these kinds of discussions, they start things. And I see a lot of, in this room, I see a lot of people that are capable of finishing things. And that's really what our practice has been a lot about and our projects have been about.
Can I piggyback on that really quickly?
Please.
Just one.
We're going to go to questions in just a minute, so go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Just one thing that's kind of important to note is on the topic of education in schools, which the previous panel also talked about. It's a really important driver of migration, both across state lines and then within metro areas. You may have seen some of this research or seen it cited that's been coming out the last couple of years by a collection of economists that has looked at it started as called the Moving to Opportunity Grant. It was really a big demonstration project with public housing reform that began back in the early 90s, and they were able to track people that moved out of highly concentrated, impoverished areas, distressed communities, who moved to other neighborhoods, and then those that stayed behind, and be able to compare them over time. And they found that for families, these are usually single moms with young kids or with teenagers, when those kids moved, especially before the age of 8 to 10, they're able to track them now 20 plus years later. Their outcomes are more akin to the neighborhood they moved to than where they came from. And those neighborhoods that they came from have remained in a distressed state, and they have a lot of the outcomes you would expect. Lack of completion in high school and very low college going rates, high crime, all these sorts of things. And so what's the difference is that the communities that they moved into have a kind of a highly engaged set of families in them. And one place that is a common convening spot for those families are schools. And so when we talk about high quality education and all the other things that we talked about earlier, that's really important. But the way that schools serve as connectors of people, that bridging social capital, it's kind of sometimes called, where people get exposed to other people that they never would have met in any other way. And then those kids that moved into those neighborhoods start hearing about going to college, and they start getting engaged in the kinds of things that you do to prepare for that. That happens because of the goals and aspirations of the families that are there, but also the neighborhood helps facilitate that. And schools are a really important part of that, and other organizations, whether the community centers, the kinds of places where civic leaders and families come together to actually do the stuff they do, is where that knowledge gets transmitted. And now we've been able to measure it, and the impact is huge on the lives of these kids.
Yeah, so Ed, so schools can be incredibly productive anchors in a community that then help uplift the community if they're run well. Mm-hmm. So we have time for one quick question, and I'm gonna, right there in the white, and we're going to do this, we're going to do it almost like a speed round so that we can let you guys get to your coffee session.
Is this on? Hi, I'm Laura Kellogg. I live in Dallas. And Elizabeth and Brian, I so applaud what you're doing to that area. I want to address gentrification. Are you worried about, it takes investment, to help develop the area, but as you know, Texas is growing. So are you worried about the people that have been there for generations, and as the neighborhood turns over, are they going to be pushed out because other people are willing to pay more to live in that area? So that's the one question. And then Ryan, you talk about the neighborhood and schools. So if, say hypothetically, these kids have choices of where they go to school, how will that impact the neighborhood if they're not going to the neighborhood schools?
Thank you so much for your question. So because we only have a minute left to go, we're going to take that first question, and I'm sure you can answer that question in under 60 seconds, right?
You want to go ahead.
I think it is risk. It's always a risk, and as you look at the southern part of the U.S., the newer cities, those cities are traditionally driven by developers. They're low on regulation and policy that protects certain parts of communities that need protection to either provide amenities or can't fit into a development business model. It's a risk, and it's something that we need to acknowledge, and there is quite a bit of acknowledgement that in most of the southern cities in the U.S., we're behind on our policy that protects historically disadvantaged neighborhoods and the residents that have been long-term in those neighborhoods. I think you, Elizabeth, you might provide more on that, but I know you've been dealing with it on the ground.
Sure. So, I'm watching the clock, so I'll make this quick. I get the gentrification question quite often, and it is something that keeps myself up at night as well as residents, because we're doing this work to bring investment and enhance quality of life for the current residents that are there. And I think the word gentrification has this double-edged sword to it, because one, it's the economic vitality piece. People want that in the neighborhood. It's the push out part that we've got to figure out how to protect. And sometimes when that push out, when you really break it down, when you're listening to people talk, what does that really mean? Does that mean a swarm of new people coming in and making sure that other people are moving out? So one of the things that we do is we educate, don't leave South Dallas. That's really hard to do though when you live in an underserved community where there's only 24% home ownership. So one of the things I do is scream from the rooftop. Right? I shame people at this point. Like, we are doing this work for the residents are here. We want to preserve the character. We want to it's such a beautiful place. You want to keep that content and that richness and culture of the community. So the fact that this community anchor has the ability to scream culture, scream history from across the rooftops, I don't take that lightly. And so I ping it every single day. But we do want the economic vitality that comes with the term of gentrification. We don't want the mass move. And so that is where we work with our local council representatives, where we've tried putting things on the state floor before. And as Brian mentioned, this is going to come down to policy.
Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panel.